The room was cold, lit only by the soft glow of the monitors tracking my father's fading heartbeat. I stood at the foot of his bed, my hands gripping the rail, trying to memorize the lines of his face. That's when my brother leaned toward our stepmother and two uncles, his voice low but sharp enough to slice through the quiet. "Don't let her near the will," Ethan said. "She's not real family." The words hit me harder than any punch. For a moment, I forgot how to breathe. My father's chest rose and fell in shallow movements. His eyes closed, completely unaware of the venom being whispered beside him. I wanted to shout, to demand he take it back, but the sound of the heart monitor slowing kept me frozen. This was the man who had raised me, who had put a roof over my head, who had taught me how to ride a bike, and my brother was trying to erase me before he was even gone. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my ears. If I stayed any closer, I was afraid Ethan would see the tears building in my eyes and think he'd won. I kept my focus on my father, willing him to open his eyes one more time to say something that would anchor me in that moment. Instead, the monitor gave one final steady tone. His chest stilled. A silence fell over the room, but it wasn't the kind of silence that comes with peace. It was heavy, full of unspoken battles and unhealed wounds. Ethan's arm slid protectively around our stepmother's shoulders, his expression molded into a perfect mask of grief. But his eyes, those cold, calculating eyes, shifted toward me with the same message he'd whispered minutes before. "You don't belong here." I wanted to scream, to demand to know what made me not real family, but my throat locked up. Instead, I stepped out of the room, the sound of my heels against the linoleum floor echoing like a countdown. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying every word Ethan had said. He was so sure of himself, so certain that my father's fortune, $500 million, would land neatly in his hands. I could almost hear his laugh, that smug tone he used whenever he thought he'd gotten his way. The next morning, in the polished wood conference room of my father's lawyer, Ethan would finally get his answer. The truth wouldn't just shock him, it would destroy the game he thought he was winning. My name is Hannah Cole, and for as long as I can remember, I've lived in a house where love felt like it came with terms and conditions. My father, Robert Cole, was a man who could turn an empty plot of land into a thriving business empire, but he never learned how to build a home that felt truly safe for me. When I was 8, my mother passed away after a long illness. Less than a year later, my father remarried Margaret, a polished, sharp-eyed woman who seemed to smile only when other people were watching. Margaret came with her own idea of what our family should look like, and it didn't include me. She and my older half-brother, Ethan, became an inseparable pair in my father's absence. Ethan was 14 when Dad married Margaret, old enough to understand exactly how to twist her favoritism to his advantage. To him, I was a burden, an outsider taking attention and resources that belonged to him. Over the years, he made sure I never forgot it. At the dinner table, his comments were coated in sarcasm. In front of friends, he called me the charity case or Margaret's unpaid babysitting gig. Margaret rarely stopped him. If anything, she seemed to enjoy the way his words chipped away at me. My father, always buried in work, seemed oblivious. He would fly out for meetings in London or Dubai, return for a weekend, and assume that family dinners and polite conversation meant harmony. The truth was, I learned early how to survive in the quiet spaces between other people's alliances. Despite all of that, my relationship with my father had moments of genuine warmth. When I was 12, he taught me how to ride a bike in the driveway, jogging alongside me in a rare afternoon without phone calls. When I graduated college, he hugged me with a pride I didn't see in his eyes often. We never said, "I love you" much, but I knew, in my own way, that I mattered to him. Time, however, has a way of testing every bond. When my father was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer, everything shifted. The man who had seemed untouchable was suddenly frail, and the house felt different, quieter, heavier. I started visiting him daily in the hospital, bringing him books I thought he'd like and reading aloud when his eyes grew too tired. Ethan didn't come nearly as often. His visits were quick, sometimes no more than a handshake, and a loud conversation about business deals in the hallway. Margaret said he was handling important matters for the family, but I noticed how her eyes lingered on the medical charts and how she always seemed to be taking notes when the doctors spoke. One afternoon, as I sat beside my father's bed reading, Margaret stepped in wearing one of her tailored suits. "He needs rest," she said flatly, motioning toward the door. "I'm not here to tire him out," I answered, my voice steady. "I just want to be with him." "Some people don't understand that presence can be more harmful than absence," she replied, before gliding out, leaving a faint scent of her perfume behind. I stayed anyway. My father opened his eyes briefly, meeting mine with a faint smile. It was small, but it was enough to keep me coming back, no matter how unwelcome the rest of the family made me feel. In those final weeks, I realized how much of my life had been defined by trying to prove I belonged, not just in the family, but in his heart. Ethan, on the other hand, seemed to be waiting for something else entirely. The glances between him and Margaret told me they had their own plan, one that didn't involve me. Still, I held on to the belief that my father, even in his weakest moments, knew who had been there for him. I didn't know it then, but the truth about where I stood in his eyes was already written down, sealed, and waiting for the day that would change everything for us all. The hospital room that night felt smaller than usual, as if the walls had shifted inward to press us all closer together. The hum of the machines was constant, but my father's breathing had grown faint, shallow, almost fragile. I stood on his right side, my fingers curled lightly around his hand. His skin felt cooler than before, but I told myself he could still feel my touch. Margaret was perched in the corner chair, her legs crossed, a silk scarf draped neatly around her shoulders. Ethan leaned against the opposite wall, arms folded, his eyes darting toward the monitor every few seconds. Two of our uncles, men who had always been more loyal to Margaret than to me, stood quietly near the door, murmuring to each other in voices too low to catch. The stillness broke when Ethan pushed off the wall and stepped closer to Margaret. He bent his head toward her, speaking in a low but deliberate tone, just loud enough for me to hear over the soft beeping. "Don't let her near the will," he said, his voice laced with disdain. "She's not real family." The words struck like a slap. My fingers tightened around my father's hand instinctively. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined it. But then Margaret's lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, but a look of agreement, before she glanced at me with eyes as sharp as glass. I felt heat rise in my chest, the kind that comes right before tears or rage. Every insult Ethan had ever thrown at me, every time Margaret had treated me like I was in the way, came flooding back in one instant. But this time, it wasn't behind my back. It was right here, beside my father's bed, while he was still alive. Barely. I opened my mouth to say something, but the faint rattle in my father's breathing silenced me. His hand twitched weakly in mine, and I knew he was slipping further away. If I spoke now, the last thing he might hear would be an argument between his children. That wasn't how I wanted him to go. So I stayed quiet. My eyes stayed locked on his face, memorizing the way the light from the monitor reflected off the faint lines on his skin. I wanted to give him peace in his final moments, even if my own heart was shattering. Ethan stepped back with a satisfied smirk, returning to his place near the wall. The uncles avoided my gaze. Margaret folded her hands neatly in her lap, as if nothing had happened. Minutes passed in tense silence until the monitor gave a long, flat tone. My father's chest stilled. The air in the room seemed to freeze. Margaret stood first, smoothing the scarf over her shoulder. Ethan stepped forward, placing a hand on her back in a display of support that felt rehearsed. He bent his head as if whispering words of comfort, but his eyes found mine across the bed, hard and unyielding. I stepped away from the rail, my hands trembling, and let the nurse in to shut off the machines. There were no embraces offered, no words shared with me. It was as though my father's death had given them permission to close the door on me entirely. As the family left the room, I overheard Ethan speaking to one of the uncles. "It's all going to be fine now. Dad's business will stay where it belongs." They walked past me without a glance. I followed a few steps behind, my mind already spiraling. What did Ethan know about the will? Had my father cut me out? The thought made my stomach twist. That night, I sat in my apartment staring at the ceiling, the darkness pressing in from all sides. The words "not real family" repeated in my head until they felt like a drumbeat. Ethan's confidence wasn't random. He believed he had already won. But I knew one thing. I had to face whatever truth the will held. No matter what it said, I needed to hear it for myself. And if Ethan was so certain I had nothing, then maybe, just maybe, the shock waiting for him would be bigger than the one waiting for me. The morning after my father's death was gray and damp, the kind of weather that made everything feel heavier. I sat at my kitchen table staring at the untouched mug of coffee in front of me, my phone buzzing with a text from my uncle. Reading of the will. 10 a.m., Cole and Harris law offices. For a few minutes, I considered not going. The memory of Ethan's voice in the hospital was still fresh, still burning like a bruise that wouldn't fade. Part of me didn't want to give him the satisfaction of seeing me sit there waiting for scraps. But another part, the one my father had raised, knew I couldn't hide from the truth, whatever it was. I showered, dressed in a simple black dress and blazer, and drove into the city. The closer I got to the towering glass building where my father's lawyer worked, the more I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. The law firm's lobby smelled faintly of leather and old books. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, looked up as I walked in. "You must be Hannah," she said with a small smile. "Mr. Harris is expecting you. Conference room 2. I stepped inside and immediately felt the shift in the air. Ethan was already there, sitting with one leg crossed over the other, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. He was dressed like he'd just stepped out of a magazine, tailored suit, gold cufflinks, but the smugness in his eyes ruined the polish. Margaret sat beside him, her posture perfect, pearl earrings glinting under the recessed lighting. She didn't look at me directly, only acknowledged my presence with the barest tilt of her chin. 2 uncles were seated at the far end of the long, polished table, their conversation halting as I entered. I walked to the opposite side and took a seat, placing my bag on the floor and keeping my expression as neutral as I could manage. "Didn't think you'd have the nerve to show up," Ethan said, his tone dripping with mockery. I met his gaze. Dad raised me to face the truth, not run from it. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line, as though even that small exchange was too much for her taste. Before anyone could respond, the door opened, and Daniel Harris, my father's longtime lawyer, stepped inside carrying a thick envelope. His hair had gone grayer since I last saw him, but his voice was the same, calm, steady, deliberate. "Thank you all for coming," he began, setting the envelope on the table. "I know this is a difficult time, but Robert was very clear about wanting his wishes carried out promptly and precisely." He glanced around the table, his eyes lingering on me for a brief moment longer than on the others. It was subtle, but enough to make Ethan shift uncomfortably in his chair. Daniel started by reading small bequests, donations to charities my father supported, trust funds for longtime employees, a scholarship fund in my mother's name. Ethan barely listened, tapping his fingers against the arm of his chair. Margaret kept her gaze fixed on Daniel, her expression unreadable. With each page, I felt my pulse quicken. The room seemed to shrink, the air thick with anticipation. I kept my hands folded in my lap, forcing myself to remain still. Finally, Daniel reached the part everyone had been waiting for. He paused, unfolding the final sheet of paper with deliberate care. "In regard to the remainder of my estate," he began, "including all business holdings, real estate, financial accounts, and personal property." Ethan straightened in his seat, his smirk returning as if he already knew what was coming. My stomach tightened. Whatever came next would either confirm every fear I'd carried since the hospital, or change everything. Daniel's voice was steady, but every word seemed to drop into the room like a stone into still water. "In regard to the remainder of my estate, including all business holdings, real estate, financial accounts, and personal property, I leave it in its entirety to my only true daughter, Hannah Grace Cole." The silence that followed was thick and absolute. My ears rang with the weight of his words. I felt Ethan's stare before I even looked up. His jaw was slack, the smug grin gone, as if it had been ripped off his face. Margaret's hands, perfectly folded a moment earlier, tightened around each other until her knuckles whitened. "This is some kind of mistake," Ethan snapped, leaning forward in his chair. She's not even—" Daniel raised a hand calmly, cutting him off. "Your father anticipated there might be confusion. He prepared a letter to accompany the will, which I will now read." From a separate folder, Daniel pulled out a single sheet of paper, the edges slightly creased from being handled. His tone softened as he began. "Hannah, you have been the only one who has stood by me without asking for anything in return. You sat by my bed when I was too weak to speak, and you never turned your visits into opportunities to talk about money or power. You gave me your presence, and that is something I could never buy. Blood does not define family. Loyalty and love do. You are my only true daughter." My chest tightened, and I swallowed hard against the lump in my throat. I didn't dare look at Ethan, but I could feel the heat radiating off him like an open flame. Daniel continued reading my father's words. "Ethan, I know you will see this as a betrayal, but the truth is you chose your path long ago. I gave you opportunity after opportunity to prove that family meant more to you than ambition. Each time, you showed me otherwise. I hope one day you understand why I made this decision." When Daniel finished, he placed the letter back into the folder and looked around the table. "Robert's instructions are clear. The estate passes to Hannah in full, effective immediately. All legal safeguards have been put in place to ensure these wishes are honored." Ethan shot up from his chair, his face red. "I'll fight this. I don't care how many lawyers it takes. I'll prove she doesn't deserve a cent." "You're welcome to try," Daniel replied evenly. "But your father took every precaution to make sure this could not be contested successfully." Margaret rose slowly, her gaze locking on me for the first time since I'd entered the room. There was no warmth in it, only cold calculation. "Enjoy it while you can," she said quietly, before walking out with Ethan close behind. The uncles avoided eye contact as they followed, their loyalty clearly shifting with the wind. The door closed and the sudden quiet felt almost unreal. Daniel looked at me with a gentler expression. "Your father wanted you to know he was proud of you. He told me more than once that leaving everything to you wasn't about money. It was about trust." I nodded, unable to speak for a moment. My mind replayed the nights in the hospital, the way my father had smiled faintly when he saw me. All those moments that felt small at the time suddenly made sense. I had walked into the room expecting to be erased. Instead, I had been named as the one person my father believed in completely. It wasn't just about the fortune, it was the truth behind it. As I left the office, the city outside felt different. The air was still damp from the morning rain, but I lifted my face to it, breathing in deeply. The fight with Ethan wasn't over. I knew he would come at me with every ounce of spite he had, but for the first time I felt unshakable. My father had made his choice, and he had made it in my favor. The next week passed in a blur of phone calls, paperwork, and tense silences. Ethan made good on his threat almost immediately, hiring a lawyer and announcing to anyone who would listen that he'd been robbed. Margaret didn't bother speaking to me directly, but I knew she was behind every hostile email and every rumor suddenly swirling through my father's business network. Daniel reassured me at every turn. "Your father anticipated this. His documentation is airtight. They can make noise, but they can't undo what's already been done." Still, the weight of it wasn't something I could brush off easily. $500 million wasn't just money. It was responsibility. Overnight, I'd gone from being the family's quiet outsider to the person holding everything my father had built. I could almost feel Ethan's resentment pressing in from every direction, but instead of shrinking from it, I focused on what mattered. The first thing I did was visit my father's office. It was just as he'd left it. Polished mahogany desk, shelves lined with business books and framed photographs. I walked slowly around the room, stopping at the picture of us when I was 10, both of us smiling in front of a fishing boat we'd rented one summer. His arm was around my shoulders, the grip firm and steady. Standing there, I realized that while Ethan had been chasing approval through power and wealth, my connection with Dad had been built in small, steady moments. He hadn't left me the fortune because I was his blood. He'd left it because I'd shown up when it counted. When the legal dust began to settle, I started making changes. I visited the employees who had worked for my father for decades, personally assuring them their jobs were safe. I met with the scholarship board to expand funding for students in need. Every step felt like a way of honoring him, not just the businessman, but the man who had taught me that loyalty mattered more than appearances. Ethan, meanwhile, grew quieter in public, but more aggressive in private. One afternoon, he confronted me outside the courthouse. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low. "Dad made a mistake. You'll regret this." I met his glare with a steady look. Dad didn't make a mistake. He just finally saw you for who you are. His jaw clenched, but he didn't respond. He turned and walked away, shoulders stiff with anger. That night, I went to the park my father loved. It was the same one we'd walked through on crisp autumn mornings when I was little, holding cups of hot chocolate. I found the wooden bench near the pond, the one where he'd once told me that the real measure of a person wasn't how much they had, but how they treated people when they had nothing. I sat there for a while, listening to the quiet ripple of the water. Then I placed a single white rose on the bench. "Thank you, Dad," I whispered, "for everything." In that moment, I understood that the inheritance wasn't about wealth. It was about recognition, proof that I had belonged all along, even when my family tried to convince me otherwise. The lesson was clear, and it's one I carry with me every day. Family isn't defined by the names on a birth certificate or the blood in your veins. It's defined by loyalty, by presence, by love given without expectation. My father saw that in me, and no amount of bitterness from Ethan or Margaret could erase it. I left the park with my head high, the late afternoon sun breaking through the clouds. Whatever storms came next, I knew I had already weathered the worst, and I had come out of it not just as the heir to my father's fortune, but as the daughter he had chosen. And that's how my father's final words changed everything. Not just my future, but the way I see myself. It taught me that no matter how loud someone's doubt is, the truth will always speak louder in the end. If you were in my position, would you have walked away from the reading of the will or faced it like I did? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. If you connected with this story, make sure to give the video a like, share it with someone who might need to hear it, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful, true life stories every week. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.